Robin Hood's death. Brrr! The cold seeps into my bones after a night out in the greenwood these days, said Robin, sitting up stiffly and rubbing the life back into his limbs. John stood and stretched, looking up through the thick green summer leaves to see the sun sparkling through the branches. He could already feel its warmth on his face and his arms, and he had not slept under a blanket in a week or two. "Did you ever go to see the cunning woman, Rob?" he said. "I'm sure the friar advised you to last week, and a fortnight ago, and last month." "Pfft! I don't need old superstitions or ancient magic," sniffed Robin. He paused to let out a series of loud, hacking coughs that racked his body and left him shaking for a minute or two after the fit passed. "You need something, Rob," said John. "A physician?" "And how much gold will that require?" demanded Robin. "Besides, they are all in the pocket of the king, the physicians." Will brought over a bowl of hot porridge and a mug of ale. "How are you feeling?" he asked as Robin sat down in the nook of a fallen tree and took it from him. "Fine," said Robin brusquely, coughing again. He put down his porridge and picked up his bow to shoot a practice arrow at a nearby target, but as he raised his arms, a trembling took root in his hands and travelled all the way up to his shoulders, and he could barely string the arrow, much less shoot it. There was an uncomfortable silence, but finally Robin himself broke it. "I think I shall go visit my cousin at Kirklees," he said. "She is the prioress there, you know. She is a skilled healer. I shall ask her to bleed me. That will sort me out, I'm sure." "You don't look like you need to lose more blood, Rob," said John, looking at the spattering of blood on Robin's arm where he had been coughing. "Nonsense," said Robin. "A quick bleed will be just the trick to get this cough under control." "Kirklees, doesn't Red Roger live near there?" said Will. "I think you should bring a large group of the men with you, Rob. You know Roger has never forgiven you for helping that impoverished knight repay a debt to his kinsman the abbot, much to the abbot's annoyance, as he had other plans. You need protection." "I do not need protection from anybody," snapped Robin, setting off another coughing fit. "John will come with me for company on the road. That is all." Will opened his mouth to object, but Robin grabbed his bowl, hot porridge slurping out and spilling over his hands, and took himself off to sit by the river and eat. "I have heard rumours about Rob's cousin, you know," Will said to John as they watched their friend lurch away. "She is very close with Red Roger, shall we say?" "I've heard that too," said John, "but what can we do? Robin has not lived this long out here in the forest by rolling over and doing what someone else tells him to do. His stubborn streak is what has kept so many of us alive these many years." "But will it keep him alive?" demanded Will. "Only God knows the answer to that," said John. Robin and John gathered a few basic provisions and set off on the walk to Kirklees at dawn the next morning. It was summer and the days were long. A cool morning breeze quickly gave way to a gathering heat as they picked their way through the huge ferns that had sprung up between the trees and trod down bracken underfoot. Wood pigeons called incessantly from the upper branches, and the air smelled of wild honeysuckle blossom. As the sun climbed across the sky and they started to think of resting during the hottest part of the day, they heard the sound of water tumbling over rocks and splashing into a pool. Between the trees they saw a riverside path winding its way along a fast-flowing stream of water. The ground here rose and fell, and the river poured itself over a succession of small ledges into a series of deep pools. Robin and John both took a deep drink of cold, clear water, and their tired feet revived a little as they walked along the stones by the waterside. Then the ground levelled off and the river widened out, long strings of moss flaring out into the rushing water. As the river spread out before them, they saw that up ahead someone had put a large plank across the water to serve as a rough bridge. In the middle of the plank, at the heart of the river, sat an old woman with long matted grey hair that hung loose over her shoulders as she bent over the water. She was wearing a green dress and washing something in the river that also appeared to be green, blending in with the green mosses and green weeds that danced all around it in the gurgling water. As they slowly walked closer, they could hear her mumbling and muttering something under her breath, her head still bent over her work. She must have heard them, but she did not choose to look up at them. Robin reached the end of the plank and stepped onto it gingerly, walking carefully until he was close enough to hear what she was saying. She was muttering a series of increasingly violent curses against the name of Robin Hood. "Old woman," said Robin, more taken aback than concerned, "why are you cursing Robin Hood?" The old woman turned her head sharply to look at him and hissed like a snake or like a cornered cat. But she said nothing and went back to her washing. Robin looked down at the work that seemed to occupy her so much. It was green clothing she was washing, but as he peered at it more closely, he saw that it was not a woman's dress like the one she herself wore, but a man's tunic, and she was washing blood out of it. She was wringing it out over and over again with a strong, bony grip, but instead of getting cleaner, every time she wrung it out, more fresh red blood seemed to pour out of the tunic to be carried away by the river. Robin felt the vibration of the plank as John's heavy step made its way across it and towards him, though he kept his back to John and his face to the mysterious old woman. He sensed the movement of the air as John took his staff from his back and held it out. Stilling the shaking of his hands, Robin slowly drew his sword and held it out until it pointed directly at the old woman's neck. "Old woman," he said, "why are you cursing the name of Robin Hood?" "I am neither old nor woman," intoned the creature as she slowly turned her head to look at him once more. "I am here to wash out the blood from the clothes of the man known as Robin Hood, for he bleeds and he dies today." Robin laughed. "You are mistaken, whatever you are," he said, lowering his sword and returning it to his belt. "For I am Robin Hood, and look, these are my clothes, and they are quite clean." He held his arms wide to display a green tunic identical to the one the old woman was washing. Not quite clean, if truth be told, but free of bloodstains. "To be sure I will bleed today, for I am going to Kirklees, so that my cousin at the abbey may let my blood. But I am going for a cure, not a death sentence. The prioress is my kinswoman. She will not hurt me." "How nice to be so confident," sneered the old woman, and she went back to her washing. Robin and John inched their way back across the makeshift bridge, for their way lay on that side of the river. But when Robin had regained the path and gone to sit under a large oak tree to rest before continuing, John, his staff still held up before him, returned to the old woman. She ignored him entirely, but he peered over her shoulder at the tunic in the water, by now almost more red than green. He was sure that he could see, near the top, a little embroidered foxglove flower that Marion had once added to Robin's favourite tunic, the one he was wearing today, still bearing it, faded and a little scuffed, but holding strong. But then the old woman plunged the tunic back into the water, and it was consumed in a fountain of red blood that seemed to gush from every fibre and consumed the green entirely, and it was gone. For a moment John raised his staff as if to strike the woman, but charity or common sense prevailed, and he lowered his arms and returned to his friend, coughing uncontrollably once more where he sat in the dust under the ancient oak. Robin and John arrived at the abbey in the afternoon, the sun still fairly high as they knocked on the huge oak gate. A young and very pretty nun answered the gate, and on hearing their names she quickly sent for the prioress, who met them in the courtyard. Robin sat heavily on a stone bench, but waved cheerily as she came over, and produced a large bag of gold, £20 in all. "Well met, cousin," he said. "I am in need of your services. This gold is yours if you will let my blood today." The prioress appeared to think for just a moment, but quickly she plastered a smile on her face and said, "Yes, of course, my poor cousin, you are in a bad way. You must come up to my room where I will do the bloodletting." Robin got up and John moved to come with them, but the prioress held out her hand. "John," she said quickly, "there is no need for you to sit through the whole operation. Would you not do me a favour and help Sister Mary here to repair the woodshed? It is a tough job, and she will be glad of your muscles to help, I'm sure." The prioress gestured towards the young nun who had let them in, who looked hopefully at John with sparkling eyes. Reluctantly, John followed the girl out back towards the woodshed. He felt a deep sense of foreboding in doing so, but could not think of a sensible reason to refuse the prioress such a reasonable request. Robin followed his cousin up to her room, where she settled him on her own bed, surprisingly comfortable for a member of a religious order, Robin thought, but perhaps he had been sleeping out in the greenwood for too long. She brought out her blood irons and gestured to a wooden bench below the window, where she indicated Robin should leave his sword and his bow and quiver full of arrows. Robin could not suppress a little shudder as she unwound the long, sharp blood irons from their silk wrappings and brought out a wide bowl to catch the blood. Robin sat back and pulled up his sleeve, and the prioress tied a scrap of wool around his upper arm, took out her sharpest and biggest blood iron, and made a deep cut into his flesh on the inside of the elbow. At first the blood flowed thick and healthy, and Robin tried to relax and allow the treatment to work. But the time seemed to drag on, and he found himself becoming dizzy even as he sat on the prioress' too comfortable bed. He looked down and saw that the blood was becoming thin and watery, and the wide, shallow bowl beneath his arm was almost full. Robin looked up at his cousin as she sat beside him, the blood iron still buried in his arm. She stared back at him, her eyes wide but blank and empty, her face expressionless. "Treachery!" he gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. At that moment the door burst open, but it was not Little John come to the rescue. It was Red Roger of Doncaster, his sword drawn. He wasted no time and slashed at Robin, catching his green tunic around the knees. But Robin was too quick for him, even in his weakened state. The outlaw leapt up from the bed, ripping the blood iron from his arm and sending the bowl flying, his own red blood pouring out over the stone floor and seeping into the rushes that covered it. Robin grabbed the prioress roughly by the arms and used her as a shield to stumble across the room to where his sword lay underneath the window. Red Roger nearly stabbed her with a thrust of his sword meant for Robin, diverting the blade to clang against the stone wall of the abbey at the last minute. Robin saw the look of panic and horror on his face in that moment, and he knew he had found a weakness. But he was forced to let go of the woman so he could haul up his own sword with both hands, for even his right arm was weak and trembling, and the bloodless left was useless. He was too slow. The prioress leapt out of the way, and Roger's next thrust found its target, slicing into the side of Robin's body, revealing ghastly white skin and yet more red blood beneath the green tunic. Robin gave him a good answer, though. As Roger glanced towards the prioress, Robin raised his own sword and cut open the man's throat. The prioress screamed, and Robin spun around and shoved the body out of the window, leaving Roger in the dirt to the dogs. John heard the commotion, the sounds of furniture thrown around the room, the woman's scream, and the sickening thunk of a body hitting the ground below. Dropping the hammer he was holding, he ran straight into the abbey and up to the prioress' room where Robin lay. He passed several nuns on the way, but none tried to stop him. Terrified and confused, they all pressed themselves against the walls or flung themselves to the ground, whispering prayers and clutching at their veils. John stepped through the open door of the prioress' chamber to find Robin lying on the wooden bench by the window, his skin white as a winding sheet, but his clothes spattered with blood, his sword lying limp across his body. The prioress sat on the floor by the bed, shaking and gasping for air. John drew his own sword and held it to her throat. "Treachery, Rob?" he asked. "Aye," said Robin, struggling for breath. "I will set fire to this hall," said John fiercely, "and burn up the whole of Kirklees." "No!" cried Robin, trying to raise himself up on his elbow. "I have never in my life harmed a woman, John, and I do not intend to start now, much less a whole abbey full of them. Let my cousin go. Her lover is dead, and I am dying. She can do no more harm." The prioress looked up at him one last time with dead eyes and fled the room. John let her go. "Give me my bow and arrows, John," said Robin. They had fallen to the floor by his feet. John took the sword from his friend and laid both blades down on the bloody bed. He pulled out Robin's bow and an arrow with glossy black fletching feathers. "Wherever this arrow lands," said Robin, "bury me there, with my sword at my head, my arrows at my feet, and my bow by my side." Quivering, he drew back his bow one last time and let the black-fletched arrow fly. As the string thrummed and the arrow flew, the bow fell from Robin's hands. John watched the arrow fly, seeing it fall somewhere in the nearby woods. For a moment, he thought he saw the shadow of an old woman in a green dress standing under the trees in the dying light, staring directly at him. But he blinked and she was gone, and when he turned back to the body of his friend, he realised he was alone. The end. Hello, I'm Ed Harrisson. Welcome back to Creepy Classics, the podcast retelling and discussing ancient, medieval and early modern ghost stories with new episodes every 2 months. And the big news this month is that Creepy Classics now has merch. I have designed some mugs, t-shirts, hoodies, all that kind of the usual thing, using my brand new logo, which I designed myself and which was then digitized and tidied up by my friend Jess at Firefly Faye Designs. So if you head on over to my new website, julietharrison.co.uk, and don't forget it's juliette.harrisson, then check it out. And if you fancy a new mug or travel mug or hoodie or t-shirt, anything to get you in the mood for Halloween, even if it's a bit early, then let me know what you think. I was really excited to do this story because I love the stories of Robin Hood, have done ever since I was a child. I think the Errol Flynn version would be the first one that I saw. Or no, Maid Marian and Her Merry Men, which was a CBBC series written by Tony Robinson, who's best known from Blackadder and Time Team. Maid Marian and Her Merry Men was an absolute work of genius. If you've ever seen the pancake rap by Danny John Jules for Pancake Day going around the internet on Pancake Day, that's the show that it's from. But after that, then I saw the Errol Flynn one, and then the Disney one with the fox, and eventually Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves when I was old enough. I haven't done Robin Hood before because this is the only supernatural element in the story cycle relating to Robin Hood. Robin Hood's folklore is very unusual in that it is almost completely lacking supernatural elements. It's one of the things that makes people think there was probably maybe more than one real person who inspired the stories. The early stories are set both in Yorkshire near Barnesdale and in Sherwood Forest in Nottinghamshire, and they flit back and forth between the two in a lot of the early ballads, particularly The Jest of Robin Hood, which is one of the earliest complete ballads that we have. And so it's very likely that there was more than one person who inspired the stories of Robin Hood, particularly maybe somebody in Yorkshire and somebody in Nottinghamshire. But this is one of the reasons for the popularity of the idea that maybe there were real people behind the stories, even if it was more than one, because you would sort of expect there to be more supernatural stuff in a medieval folklore cycle, particularly if it wasn't based on somebody real. But this is the exception, alongside the witchcraft in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, but that was written in the early 1990s, so we're not going into that one. The Old Woman Washing at the Ford comes from a late and fragmentary ballad telling the story of the death of Robin Hood, which was preserved in the 17th century Percyfolio manuscript, but probably originated in the medieval period in some form. It has lots of little details of medieval life and kind of attitudes. It's a very medieval setting. The story of Robin Hood's betrayal by the Prioress of Kirklees, his cousin, and his death is also told in The Jest of Robin Hood, which is one of the very earliest sources for the story and comes from the late 1400s. There's also a later version of the story of the death of Robin Hood from the later 18th century, which was preserved along with the earlier 17th century one by Francis Child in a collection in the 19th century. Neither the Jest of Robin Hood from the 1400s nor the later version from the 1700s include the mysterious old woman by the river. Or there's also a scene in that 17th century one where somebody is giving something to Robin Hood. We don't know what, because there's a section missing right between the first appearance of the old woman and then it comes back in and somebody's giving him something, and that whole section is missing. So I have had to be reasonably inventive based on other sources with what's going on in that section. And neither character, if they are two different characters, Thor Ewing suggested they could be the same person. The old woman might be then giving something to Robin Hood. But either way, they don't appear in either the earlier medieval version or the later 18th century version. It's only this one ballad that has this figure in it. In the medieval Jest, Sir Roger of Doncaster is the prioress' lover. Obviously, a prioress should not have a lover. The Jest is actually medieval and doesn't really make a big deal of it. It's basically one of the themes of the Jest of Robin Hood is the corruption of members of the clergy, and particularly higher ranked members of the clergy. So in the story cycle, obviously, eventually Friar Tuck turns up. He turns up in a fairly early ballad, although not in the Jest. So lower ranked members of the clergy might be okay, but the corruption of higher ranked members of the clergy, especially abbots and prioresses and higher ranked priests, is a theme throughout the Jest of Robin Hood. And the Jest comes from the Catholic medieval context. It's written, it's contemporary more or less. It's set in the past, but not the distant past. And, the knowledge that there are plenty of medieval clergy who are having love affairs is something that medieval people would, not be that desperately shocked by. Yes, they're not supposed to. That doesn't mean they didn't do it. In the 17th century version, the murderer of Robin Hood is Red Roger rather than Sir Roger of Doncaster, and he kills him after the prioress has weakened Robin by bleeding him, although it doesn't mention him being the prioress lover, but given the context, that would make sense. In the late 18th century version, Robin is killed directly by the prioress, bleeding him rather than by her weakening him so that Red Roger can kill him. The scene of Robin shooting the arrow out of the window and saying he should be buried where it lands is from the 18th century version, but it's so famous, and it even made it into one of the films, into Robin and Marion, starring Sean Connery and Audrey Hepburn. So I went with that for the ending. In medieval Catholic theology, you want to be buried in sacred ground. So it's not surprising that that comes from a later version where the author has probably been Protestant and is also just not medieval and isn't thinking about that. In the medieval period, you would want to be buried in sacred ground, so you'd want to be buried in the grounds of the abbey. There is a Robin Hood's grave near to the ruins of Kirklees Priory in Yorkshire, in the woods near the ruins. Exactly when this was identified as Robin Hood's grave is unclear, and it's presumably been identified on the basis of this story. Obviously, Red Roger, or Roger of Doncaster, is a much lesser known enemy. In fact, he doesn't really show up anywhere else. So Roger of Doncaster gets a few other mentions. Red Roger isn't really all that well known as an enemy of Robin Hood, but the Sheriff of Nottingham and Guy of Gisborne are both dead by this point. They have been killed by Robin in earlier stories, or in stories set earlier in the cycle. The Abbot and the Poor Knight are characters in the earlier parts of the Jest of Robin Hood, and I was basically just trying to come up with some reason that Red Roger wants to kill him. So I made him a kinsman of this abbot who Robin has ticked off earlier in the story. Robin Hood and Little John with a staff on a plank over a river is, of course, a common theme, especially in the movies, but it dates back at least to a 17th century ballad called Robin Hood and Little John. So I had to mention Little John getting his staff out when they're on the plank over the river, even though obviously they don't fight each other in this one. Maid Marian actually belongs to later tradition. She's not particularly early, so I left in, I added my own very brief reference to her, mainly because I needed a way to identify the tunic the woman was washing as definitely Robin's. But I didn't talk about her very much because she doesn't really feature, well, she doesn't feature at all in the medieval tradition, and I was trying to keep it as close to the medieval tradition as possible. Even though the old woman appears in a 17th century version, I think it is a 17th century version with quite deep medieval roots. So I was trying to keep it as close to the medieval tradition as I could, although I had to have him shoot the arrow out and say he wanted to be buried where it landed, because it's just, that's too famous a part of this story to go with a different version. I had Will bring Robin a mug of ale because in the medieval period, people often felt it was healthier to drink beer or ale than water. Women would be expected to brew ale for their households. The water often carried disease. It was thought that the ale was healthier. It would be probably quite weak ale, but that is something that people would drink at breakfast time. I haven't come across any references to cunning folk in the stories of Robin Hood, apart from Prince of Thieves, but a friar recommending one would not be out of place in the medieval period before the early modern witch trials, which is, if you're thinking of this period where witches were persecuted, well, first of all, real witches, cunning folk, might get caught up in the persecutions, but that isn't really who they were going after. The idea of witchcraft that was at the heart of the persecutions was an idea of witchcraft that never really existed, of people meeting up in covens and worshipping the devil and all sorts of things. That bears almost no relation with any evidence for real life magical practices at all. And secondly, it was in the early modern period, not the medieval period. There were some witch trials in the medieval period, but that, if you're thinking of this period where women in particular, but also some men, are very vulnerable to being accused of witchcraft and executed for it, you are thinking of a later period than the medieval period. That's basically from the late 1400s and into the 1500s through to the late 1600s. Monasteries and abbeys were also places people could go to for medical treatment. They would have medical texts from the ancient world in their libraries, particularly the texts of Galen, who was one of the most popular ancient Greco-Roman physicians whose work was used for centuries. And they would also have herb gardens where they could grow remedies. Numerous secondary sources have claimed that monks and other clergy were forbidden from practising surgery or bloodletting, either after the Council of Tours in 1163 or after the Lateran Council of 1215, or sometimes it's claimed that bloodletting was forbidden under Pope Honorius III, who reigned as Pope 1216 to 1227. The Council of Tours actually forbade monks and canons from leaving to study law or medicine, so they couldn't go away to university or whatever and study for medicine. That didn't forbid them from practising it. The Fourth Lateran Council under Pope Innocent III in 1215 does forbid any deacon, subdeacon or priest from taking part in surgery that involves burning or cutting, and Pope Honorius III forbade the study of laws and physic to deacons, archdeacons, rural deans, priests, cantors and other clerics. But the ballads are all very, very clear that Robin is going to his cousin the prioress for bloodletting, so it's possible the prohibition didn't apply to nuns, may not have applied to female ordained people. Or the other possibility is people just didn't follow it. Pope's a long way away from England. The prioress has a lover already, so I think not all laws are regularly followed. The example I always bring up when I'm teaching how we can use law as a source for history is by asking my class, of those of you who drink alcohol, who waited until your 18th birthday to drink it? It's not very many people. I did also include a detail from the ballads where the blood gets thinner as the prioress bleeds Robin too much. I cannot vouch for the medical accuracy of that. That is what the ballad says happened, with a medieval understanding of the effect on the human body of extreme blood loss. I mentioned a few possible dates for prohibitions on monks doing bloodletting. There is also a huge debate about when the stories of Robin Hood in general should take place. In 1420, a Scottish chronicler called Andrew de Winton said Robin Hood and Little John were active in the years 1283 to 85 in Inglewood and Barnsdale. That would be the reign of King Edward I. In the 1440s, a Scotsman called Walter Bower put the rise of the famous murderer Robin Hood, as well as Little John with their accomplices, in the year 1266. This is during the reign of King Henry II of England, right after the defeat and death of Simon de Montfort, a rebel baron and leader of the Second Barons' War in 1265. Another Scotsman called John Major, writing a history of Greater Britain in 1521, said Robin Hood and Little John were active during the captivity of Richard I in 1193 to 94. And that, of course, is the one that the current popular tradition goes with. That is the one the movies usually go with, a couple of exceptions. Most movies and TV shows about Robin Hood will be set in 1193, with Richard I having been kidnapped and held to ransom by the ruler of Austria. His mother, Eleanor, is trying to raise taxes to set him free, and his brother John is trying to raise taxes to pay them to keep him. That did really happen. The Jest of Robin Hood names the king as Edward and describes the king making a tour around the country, including Nottingham, which matches Edward II's royal progress of April to November 1323. But that is a very late date. There are already outlaws going around calling themselves Robin Hood or Robin of the Hood or similar names before that. And they have presumably named themselves after the famous figure. So that seems like a really late date, if there was a real Robin Hood, for him to have been around. Edward I reigned 1272 to 1307, and Edward II 1307 to 1327. The most common suggestions for a time when Robin would be active if he was real would be the fairly long reign of Henry III, 1216 to 1272, or the 1190s and the captivity of Richard I. The Jest of Robin Hood also mentions reconciling with the king and then falling out with the king again. And historically, Richard I is king. He is ransomed by his mother and briefly visits England before he goes off on crusade again. And then he dies with no children and is followed by his brother John. John does eventually become king on Richard's death. So I've been vague and sort of assumed, let's put it in the same time as the movies go for, in the 1190s, and assume that, Richard came back and Robin was obviously reconciled with Richard. He was never against Richard. And then John becomes king later and Robin goes back into hiding in the Greenwood. That's the assumption behind where I've gone with the story, and the fact that they're older and they're still hiding out in the Greenwood and sleeping in the forest and they're still outlaws. I'm gone with the assumption that we are now in the reign of King John, who does not like Robin Hood, and that's why they're living in the woods. But I was deliberately vague about it. I have pretty much assumed a date of before 1300, which does rule out Edward II or III, or at least only very shortly after 1300, because I have set my story before the Little Ice Age, which saw the climate, the temperatures fall. In Europe, through much of the later medieval and into the early modern period, temperatures were lower overall. Winters were very cold, summers were not particularly warm, and that starts around 1300 or maybe 1400. I've basically assumed a warm summer that's happening before 1300. My description of the mysterious old woman is based on the bean-nighe, or washerwoman. This is a woman from Scottish mythology, but she also has parallels in Irish and obviously Welsh and English. This is an English text. She is found alone by rivers or streams, washing the clothes of those soon to die. She is a death omen, and your fate is sealed unless you can stop her. In some traditions, they are women who died giving birth and have to keep washing until the point they would have died otherwise. They're often small, I kind of left that out, but they sometimes wear green, and I did include that because of the neat parallel with Robin himself. I left out a detail where some of them have long dangling breasts, and if you can feed from one, you become her foster child, and she'll tell you what you want to know, including who is about to die. Interesting as that is, I decided it didn't go with the tone of my story. In some areas, if you get her at sword point, she has to tell you everything, but you might have to answer her questions as well. I sort of did half of that one. The detail of her long hair comes from medieval Irish texts describing a bav woman who is also a death omen. And of course, there is a clear link between the bean-nighe and the Irish Banshee, the an Banshee, Bansydd, Banseed. In early Irish sources, washing clothes is often associated with the goddess of war, Bavd or Morrigan. The washing motif then kind of splits off and becomes separated from the Banshee later on, but there are clear connections with the foreboding washerwoman from early Irish texts and Scottish Gaelic material with bean-nighe. Patricia Lysaght suggests the washerwoman motif was probably more popular in the medieval periods, and the Irish Banshee folklore doesn't really tend to draw on that these days. Sometimes they're washing a shroud or a winding sheet rather than clothes. There's also the Welsh Gérard, who sometimes wails her death omen at streams or crossroads and is sometimes washing her hands. Obviously, Tales of Robin Hood are English, but they were also popular in Scotland, as you can tell from the number of Scottish scholars who were trying to work out when they were supposed to take place. And some of them originate in Yorkshire. Yorkshire is separated from Scotland by the whole of Northumberland, so it's not geographically massively close, but there must be some historic links because I've been reading Bram Stoker's Dracula, and the Yorkshire dialect that Stoker writes, Stoker's Irish, but spent a lot of time researching for Dracula in Whitby in Yorkshire, and the Yorkshire dialect includes fash, which is Scots Gaelic. If you've ever watched Outlander, Jamie is forever telling Claire, dinny fash, don't worry. So there must be some kind of connection between Yorkshire and Scotland going back to the medieval period. I'll have to look into it more. These mysterious washerwomen also have a connection with white ladies, Iladi Wen in Welsh folklore, often seen around Halloween, Nos Galan Gaif, often associated with bodies of water. The lady in white is a revenant in white clothing. Sometimes there's a story of a young woman being murdered who then turns into this ghost. She appears in various contexts and might foretell death or even reveal buried treasure or lurk under the road. And these white ladies again appear across Celtic folklore and mythology from Wales, Ireland, Scotland, Brittany, Cornwall. They're similar to the French Les Lavandières, again, washerwomen, death omens. In Brittany, dames blanches, white women, can be found as ghosts, or they can be found similar to other white lady spirits. And what they do depends on the local folklore, so they might help or hinder mortals, guard treasure, haunt castles, or even lurk around a forest or bridge trying to get passers-by to dance with them. So there's a much broader category of female spirits hanging around rivers and hanging around water that expands into all sorts of areas across the Celtic world. But in this case, this figure seems very much to be the death omen, the bean-nighe type figure, where the point of the mysterious female spirit's appearance is to foretell death. I've touched on a whole bunch of fascinating topics there. So if you would like to read more, there are plenty of places online you can read the ballads. Chaucer.fas.harvard.edu has the Ballad of Robin Hood's Death, or you can see all three versions together. So the ending of the Jest of Robin Hood, the early modern version, and the later version at www.boldoutlaw.com. Thor Ewing has also collected the early sources in the book The Original Robin Hood, although Ewing's version, he's put them all together to fill in the missing passages, so he's actually invented quite a bit of it himself, so it's good, it's well worth a read, but if you want to see the actual original version, you need to go to one of the websites. On folklore relating to the bean-nighe and white ladies and mysterious female Celtic spirits more generally, you can have a look at DeeDee, Chainey and Willow Winsham, Treasury of Folklore, Seas and Rivers, Delyth and Mark Norman, The Folklore of Wales Ghosts, Gérard Lomenec'h, dans Blanches et Fantômes Bretons, Patricia Lysaght, The Banshee, The Irish Supernatural Death Messenger. And if you have access to JSTOR, I had a look at Anne O'Connor's review of Lysacht's The Banshee, and at Darrell W. Armandson, Medieval Canon Law on Medical and Surgical Practice by the Clergy in the Bulletin of the History of Medicine, which is where I got the information about whether or not monks were forbidden from bloodletting. Thank you so much for listening. I'm sorry this episode was a bit late. Whole saga involving dog health issues. Hopefully I will be a little bit more prompt with the next one, although let's face it, August episode ending up in early September is quite likely. But I am sticking to the every 2 month schedule. In the meantime, you can buy my collected short stories from this podcast. 2 volumes out now, Creepy Classics Ghost Stories from Ancient Rome and Creepy Classics Ghost Stories from Ancient Greece. They're available on a variety of platforms, including Kobo, Apple, Barnes & Noble, Fable, Amazon, all the usual places. I will be bringing out a 3rd volume of collected short stories from this podcast this autumn. Creepy Classics Haunting Tales for Winter should be out in October, so keep an eye out for that one. I have a monthly newsletter sharing book news and historical fun facts you can subscribe to on Substack, so you can hear when that book comes out straight away. Creepy Classics has its own YouTube channel called Creepy Classics, which is just another place to listen to this podcast. But do also check out my other YouTube channel, Classical JG, which has new videos going up roughly once a week. I have skipped this week so I could focus on this, but more or less once a week. And of course, do check out the merch at julietharrison.co.uk. Thank you again for listening, and see you in a couple months. Creepy Classics was written and performed by Juliet Harrison. Music composed and performed by Ed Harrisson. It was produced by Juliet Harrison with assistance from Birmingham Newman University.